but we will find out. I hope that people around America won't conflate that situation with the Syrian refugee situation that's unfolding. We know that DHS has a dedicated office to counter violent extremism, and I hope to hear more about your efforts in that regard as time goes on. But I would just note, looking at the record of refugees from Afghanistan, there were virtually no refugees from Afghanistan until 1980 in the United States. And refugees came into the United States at about 2,000 to 4,000 a year until 1990. It's interesting, going back into the record, there was a congressional task force on Afghanistan. Some of our colleagues, Dana Rohrabacher, who I serve on the science committee with, was a member of that committee, and former members like Don Ritter, a Republican from Pennsylvania, and Laga Marcino, Republican from California, were on that. It was a bipartisan committee. Charlie Wilson was on that. And one of the things they said was that the United States had a moral obligation to the people of Afghanistan because of the pivotal role they had played in defeating the Red Army at a time when communism was on the march around the globe. So I think as we look at this situation and this individual who came to the U.S. as a little boy, it's important to remember that the refugees were admitted as part of the fight against communism at that time. Now I want to turn a little bit to detention in ICE. I've mentioned in the past my concern about for-profit, private detention facilities. I'm glad that the department is looking at that. I realize that change can't happen overnight, but I do believe that for the same reasons the Department of Justice has decided to go in a different direction, namely the private facilities are more expensive, they're less accountable, they fail to meet constitutional standards. I'm hopeful that we will be in a position to move in a different direction in ICE, just as the DOJ has after that report is received in a few months. Having said that, I continue to be concerned about the situation of women and children in custody. We know that mothers and children have been on a hunger strike at the facility at Berks, and I'm concerned and wondering why we couldn't provide monitored release for those women and their children. Obviously, you can't just, these are individuals who are appealing an adverse decision. They're in a different posture than the women and children in the Texas facilities. And yet, some of those little children have been essentially in jail for over a year. 5, 6-year-old kids. That really is not in keeping with American standards. And I'm wondering, Director, if it's possible to take a look at what forms of accountability, whether it's bond, whether it's ankle monitoring, whether it's placement in a facility that is more home-like and less traumatizing for children, could be looked at for this population of mothers and children.
Congresswoman, I share your concern. This is not the business we were in not that long ago. We were not in the business of family and children. This is a phenomena that has increased over the years as problems have occurred south of our borders. But I do take very seriously how long we detain families. As you know, the average length of stay is now in the teens with respect to our family facilities overall. I am familiar with the cases that you're referring to with respect to longer-term detentions. I will say that those, while I cannot comment on a specific case, I'm happy to cover that with you to the extent we can and are allowed to, specifically where we have a waiver of privacy. But generally speaking, the folks we're talking about are subject to mandatory detention outlined here in this statute. And when they're losing their appeals and we are preparing to remove them, we don't detain them for the purposes of punish them.
No, I understand that.
But to prepare them.
I will follow up with you off agenda, because there are provisions in the law that would allow them to be held in an accountable fashion. I want to turn now, since I don't have a lot of time left, to the issue of solitary confinement in civil immigration proceedings. We have had a lot of information about the use of solitary confinement in America. I mean, whether it's in criminal detention or juvenile detention, and unfortunately in civil detention. Solitary confinement does tremendous damage to people. It actually, the psychologists tell us, it can actually make a person mentally ill to be in solitary confinement for an extended period of time. Now, I have come across cases, and we've been in communication with your department about the use of solitary confinement for young people that seem frivolous to me and in fact have been changed. I understand the president has directed departments to end their practice of restrictive housing, and the department was required to submit to the White House by September 1st a report on the use of solitary confinement. Do you know when that report will be made public?
I think it'll be any day now. I don't know exactly where it is, but I have been advised, and we've kept track of. I think it'll be maybe even be early next week, before week's end next week. That's my best estimate right now.
All right. I have many other questions, but I see, Mr. Chairman, that my time has expired, and so I will yield back.
Chair thanks gentlewoman and recognizes the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. King, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate this hearing and statement of opening remarks, and I'd like to associate myself this morning, especially with that of Mr. Smith from Texas, because I think it's important that we've been at this now for almost 8 years, and the numbers don't look as discouraging, perhaps, as they did a year ago, but there's not hope on the horizon either. And I look at the numbers that Mr. Smith has rolled out, and I didn't hear them disputed, but 86,000 criminal aliens released onto our streets. And I think of the years that we worked this, and I remember testimony that came here before this committee, for years, shortly after I first arrived in this Congress. And it would be the testimony of how many people died in the desert trying to get into America. Do you have any of that data in your memory to give us an idea, a scope of how many died in the desert trying to get into America?
Oh, my goodness, sir. I've heard of those tragedies, but I don't have that at my fingertips.
Well, I remember the witnesses that came in and testified, and we saw numbers, just the Arizona desert in those years, that would say 200, 250, then the next year it went up. We saw numbers that went over 400 a year just in the Arizona desert. Brooks County, Texas has a lot as well. And I began to think about that, and I began to think about how many Americans died at the hands of those who made it through. And we've done at least 2 GAO studies on that in my time here in this Congress. Apples is a hard thing to arrive at. It's very difficult to unravel this. But I've met a number of the people, and it's heartbreaking to me to think of the many people who are suffering a loss of a loved one because we didn't enforce the law. And when I look through this list of those that have been released by ICE, and I see in this particular list I looked at a little bit ago, 101 released who had committed homicide. And how many others along the way? What's the price to Americans? So I recall Donald Trump highlighting some of the people in his statement before the convention in Cleveland. And I noticed that last week he made a statement that there are thousands of Americans that are grieving because they've lost a loved one at the hands of someone whom had been encountered by law enforcement in America, including ICE, and been released onto our streets. Would you agree with that statement?
That there are thousands?
Yes, thousands of people who are suffering the loss of a loved one.
I don't have the exact number, but I don't disagree with you, sir. And if I may, Congressman, let me tell you, I am a prosecutor. I come to this job as a prosecutor. I am used to trying to keep the community safe, and I have not discontinued that in this job. I am trying to make the most of it out of the money we have. I told you earlier that 84%
I'm
of
sorry
the
to
people.
interrupt. The clock is ticking on me, and I don't dispute what you've said, but you have to get your orders from on high. And so if this is a matter of conscience, then I'd ask you now, have you come before this Congress and told us what you needed for resources in order to enforce the law fully, 100%? What do you need for officers? What do you need for prosecutors? What do you need for judges? What do you need for prison beds? I've never seen this administration say we want to enforce 100% of the law. The signal we get looking at this data is they want that this president has given orders from on high to release these criminals onto the streets of America. And if that's egregious to you, why haven't we heard you push back against the president, and why haven't we heard that request?
I'll have to push back against the facts you're asserting, sir. I really have tried to make this clear, but there is no discretion in these releases other than for about a third of the number you're talking about. So when we continue to repeat that the administration is releasing people willy-nilly out on the streets who have criminal records, we've talked about the Zavadas. That's the United States Supreme Court. That's not ICE.
It's going to take a lot longer for us to get down into this than we actually have here. But I'd like to ask you, do you recognize these names? Sarah Root.
I do.
Brandon Mendoza.
I do.
Dominic Durden.
Yes.
Jazz Shaw.
Yes.
His father, Jamil.
Yes.
Tessa Tranchett. Tessa Tranchett and Allie Kuhnhart.
Yes, I do.
I'm glad that you do. I'm thankful that you do, and we need to remember them. This law, the laws that we have, the immigration laws that we have, are here to be enforced. If it has to be, if we have to lay out the standard that it's going to be 100%, if we have to put the resources out there to do that, this Congress, I believe in the next Congress, will be prepared to do that. We need to restore the respect for the rule of law. Americans are dying every single day because of our failure to do so and because of turning people loose on the streets that don't return back again. And I see face after face of grieving Americans. They are in the thousands over the time that I've watched this tragedy. And I'm glad that you're aware and you recognize these names. And I appreciate the personal part of this. We need a fresh start on this immigration law in this country. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. King. Director Saldana, before I recognize the gentlewoman from Texas, I am sure you know that fewer than 10% of the criminal immigrants released back into our communities are the Zavadas cases, less than 10%. So don't try to give the impression that you don't have a choice. You do have a choice on over 90%. The gentlewoman
No,
from
sir,
Texas,
that's not correct. Would you like me to give you those numbers exactly for the last?
the less than 10% is the figure we got from you.
That can't be, because I would have signed that letter probably.
Okay, we can come back to this. The gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, is
Why
recognized
wouldn't
for her
you
question.
just clear this shit up when
Let me thank the gentleman for yielding to me, and let me thank you, Mr. Donald, for your service to the nation. Thank you for your service as a U.S. Attorney and your commitment to law enforcement and your compassion and passion in the leadership that you have given. I take particular offense to the suggestion that a lifelong professional such as yourself would in any way seek to release individuals that should not be released. So first question that I ask, is it your purpose, Saldana, as the director of ICE, to release people without authority, without legal authority, that are judged criminally, and just to release them in the street? Is that your purpose as the administrator, the director?
It's not, Congresswoman.
And I'm just going to ask a series of questions. As I do so, let me also take this moment to thank the 19,000 ICE employees every day that are on the front lines and are assisting and protecting this nation. We should be grateful for their service. I work with ICE employees. I happen to have my office in the federal building in Houston, and I want to acknowledge many of them as they work throughout our community. That, I think, is very important. I also want to make the point that we are a nation of laws and a nation of immigrants. It feels to me that the line of questioning this panel seems to ignore that this nation was built on the hard work of immigrants. And some who came not willingly. I know that in my history. But what I would make the point is that we do better when we work together.